Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day and welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Joining us today is AJC CEO David Harris, one of the Jewish world's leading experts on global trends, who will take us around the world to discuss some of the key issues that AJC is focusing on. Described by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, David Harris has led AJC since 1990. Moderating this conversation is AJC Chief of Staff of the CEO, Jillian Laskowitz. After we hear from David and Jillian, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Jillian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and welcome to our worldwide audience. David, as always, it's great to be with you. And just to start us off today is February 1st. It's almost 1 year after the pandemic began and the world has drastically changed. It's 3 months after a tumultuous election here in the United States, and we just had a new administration take office. So from the perspective of a frontline Jewish advocate, what's on your mind and how are you analyzing this moment?
Well, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, hello from very snowy New York. And Jillian, your voice is kind of coming in and out. So I don't know if that's also, I think we're all affected by the weather, certainly here in the Northeast, where they're talking about up to 18 inches of snow. So how are we affected on February the 1st, Jillian? Many of us are snowed in for probably the next 2 days. It's been one heck of a year from the perspective of your time frame. We have had the pandemic that is obviously a once in a century event. I don't have to explain to this audience the ramifications of what is still an ongoing global challenge and crisis. We have had a very fierce presidential election and aftermath here in the United States. And we continue to live in a country that is very deeply divided, where we're told by surveys that as many as 70% of the Trump voters in November believe that the election results were not legitimate. So that would put the number at about perhaps 50 million Americans who continue to think that Joe Biden may be president, but the election was somehow taken away from Donald Trump. So it speaks to deep fissures in our country. So an awful lot going on. And as always, Jews are not far from the news, Jillian. So I'm sure in the next hour or so, we'll be talking about the Jewish dimension of all of this.
Absolutely. Can you hear me now? Is my audio a little better?
It is. Just keep talking loudly for the sake of our audience.
All right. So, David, just to follow up, AJC and you yourself have been concerned about Iran for well over 20 years. So what are your thoughts today? Where are we on the Iran issue? And how do you see it developing as we're looking ahead?
Yeah, Jillian, you're still going in and out. If there's anything you can do about that. So the question is about Iran. And you're absolutely right, Jillian. It's probably easily 25 years that AJC has been closely tracking the Iran issue through various administrations, through various European governments that have tried to engage Iran. And now, of course, we have a new administration that indicates it's going to try a different tack to Iran than the Trump administration. And of course, we'll be watching very closely. I mean, we're in a situation, at the risk of stating the obvious, where Iran has repeatedly proved that it is a malign actor, that it cannot be trusted, that it is a revolutionary regime, that it has expansionist aims. These are all facts. I don't think any of them are disputable. We've seen in recent years, in recent months, that Iran's reach in the Middle East continues to at least try to deepen. We're talking about neighboring Iraq. We're talking about Syria. We're talking about Lebanon. We're talking about Yemen. We're talking about Gaza, and perhaps even the West Bank. We know that because of certain loopholes in the original 2015 agreement, that the ban on Iranian conventional weapons purchases and sales has now ended. And at least technically, Iran is legally able to both buy and sell weapons from countries like China and Russia. We know that its progress on ballistic missile development and deployment continues. We know that there are concerns about other sunset provisions in the original agreement. I mention all of this because we're counting on the new Biden administration to review the events of the last 6 years since the 2015 agreement and understand that whatever may have been the impression then has been affected by events over the ensuing 6 years. And to factor all of these events into any re-engagement with Iran or any attempt to renegotiate a deal. The other thing I would say is in 2015, in the last go-round, the countries of the region were largely sidelined. In fact, some of them were caught completely by surprise by what were originally secret negotiations between the US and Iran taking place in Oman. We hope 6 years later, with all that has ensued, most recently with the dramatic Abraham Accords, the normalization deals with several Arab countries and Israel, we hope that the Biden administration will take very much into account the concerns of Sunni Arab countries in the region and of Israel. After all, first, they probably know Iran as well as any others on the planet. And secondly, whatever the decision will be made, they would be the most affected as being in Iran's geographic neighborhood.
Thank you, David. And just to follow up on the Abraham Accords, how have they been going and where are they going? What countries should we in our audience be watching for more normalization deals with Israel?
Well, I think first of all, and I know we've said it before here on the AJC calls, but the Abraham Accords were historic. And I think it's clear to anyone watching them, and we certainly are watching them. In fact, we've been watching that neighborhood and engaging with that neighborhood for close to 30 years. So in some respects, we're even more thrilled with some of the seeds that were planted, including by AJC. But every day brings exciting new news on the relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. For many of us, this is what peace is supposed to look like. This is not just a piece of paper. This is not just an agreement among decision makers or elites, if you will. This is an agreement which is reaching down to the people and is having a dramatic effect overnight on relationships between the UAE and Israel. I think Bahrain is just in the same category. Again, a deep yearning for peace. Even before the Abraham Accords, as we heard directly from Bahraini leaders, a desire to move closer in ties with Israel. The potential with Morocco is enormous for a whole host of reasons, including the fact that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis trace their roots back to Morocco and have very strong feelings about Morocco. So I expect trade and tourism and cooperation to grow dramatically, especially post-pandemic. I think Sudan is in a way a newer player on the block, although if one goes back to the Ben Gurion, Shimon Peres era, when Peres was working very closely by Ben Gurion's side, Ben Gurion had already developed a strategic notion of the outer perimeter, which meant that in his view, we could not make peace with the immediate Arab neighbors, but the outer perimeter included Iran at the time under the Shah, Turkey, Ethiopia, and Sudan, perhaps the one country people knew the least about. And in 1979, when Israel and Egypt made peace, and Egypt was ostracized in the Arab world, there were only two countries, as I recall, Oman and Sudan, who supported Egypt. So there is a history to Sudan. And by the way, I would add, and there was a Jewish community in Sudan, in Khartoum for many years. But that history was interrupted by dramatic change in government in Khartoum. Now Sudan is coming back. So I think it offers lots of potential as well. Who else? Well, let's remember that if we don't establish the threshold as normalization or a big ceremony on the White House lawn, there have been big strides made with Saudi Arabia, for example. I think that's the worst kept secret in town. Oman, to which Prime Minister Netanyahu flew openly for meetings in Muscat, the capital, and he was not the first Israeli leader either. So those two countries are countries worth watching. And there are still other countries, let's keep them unnamed, who are going to be observing very carefully. If these deals really take off and bring greater prosperity and advancement to all the countries involved, I think there are other countries who are going to overcome their reluctance, Gillian, and begin to say, hey, we're being left out. We want to be part of this as well. This is the new Middle East. This is the Middle East of cooperation. This is the Middle East of development. This is the Middle East of progress. Let's be part of it. So I hope, I believe the Biden administration will indeed continue this trajectory. And I hope over time we'll see a deepening with the four Arab countries, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, and expansion in those concentric circles as well.
Absolutely. And because you mentioned Saudi Arabia, last year at this time, AJC made history on the Muslim Jewish front when we traveled with the Mecca-based Muslim World Lead together to Auschwitz to mark 75 years since the liberation. And David, I've often heard you say that the 21st century will be the century of Muslim-Jewish relations for AJC. So I wanted to ask, what are the enduring lessons from last year's trip as we're looking at AJC's work today?
Well, I have to tell this audience, and I know that hyperbole is kind of an American art form, but there's not an ounce of hyperbole in my saying today that January 23rd, 2020 was one of the most remarkable days, I believe, not just for me personally and for those of us who were there, but I think for hope, for the triumph of hope. A huge breakthrough was achieved. Again, let me set the stage and then go to the forward-looking part of this, Gillian. The stage was that on January 23rd, at the entrance to Auschwitz, the infamous, notorious entrance with those words, Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free. Our AJC delegation met 62 Muslim leaders who traveled from 20 countries, organized and led by Dr. Mohammed Alisa, as you said, the Secretary General of the Muslim World League. I stress, based in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and appointed to his position by none other than the King of Saudi Arabia. That was the level of this delegation. It was the highest ranking Muslim delegation ever since 1945, not just to visit Auschwitz, but to visit any death camp. It's a day that I will never forget. There were any number of highlights, but perhaps the most enduring was towards the end of our visit. We were in Birkenau, which was the site of the annihilation of close to 1 million Jews, if you will, the sister camp of Auschwitz, just 2 miles away. And we were by the remnants of the crematoria. It's almost hard for me to speak as I think about this. And there were the Muslim leaders understanding from the guides the gravity of this place, not just for Jews, but for humanity. And they began to pull out their prayer rugs. And right there, 20, 30 feet from the remnants of the crematoria, they conducted a memorial service in memory of the victims of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And they didn't do it stealthily, clandestinely. The New York Times was there, the BBC was there, most of the major Arab media outlets were there. The world saw it, and the message was clear. For those who think the Holocaust was a myth, for those who want to indulge in Holocaust denial, we are here to tell you that we have borne witness. What happens next? Well, we have said the 20th century for the American Jewish Committee was in many respects the century of Christian-Jewish relations, and especially Catholic-Jewish relations after the Second World War. And that's a story unto itself, one we at AJC are very proud of, but it culminated in a way in 1965, when the Second Vatican Council finally, after centuries and centuries and centuries, abandoned the teaching of deicide. If you will, drop the charge that the Jews were responsible for the killing of Jesus. And that charge had caused so much death and destruction and persecution and turmoil for Jews throughout Europe and the world. It took many years for that message from Rome and the Vatican to be distributed to local parishes around the world. But I think most of us on this call would say we have witnessed a veritable revolution in Christian-Jewish and in particular Catholic-Jewish relations, and AJC is proud of its own role. The 21st century holds the new challenge. Can we similarly write a new chapter in Muslim-Jewish relations? We at AJC are determined, we are absolutely determined to leave no stone unturned in trying to achieve that revolution in this century. And fortunately, we have some reason for hope. I mentioned the trip to Auschwitz and what it suggested. How about the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council that AJC established 5 years ago, and that's going so strongly, with a full-time dedicated staff at AJC who wake up every morning and whose sole responsibility is to ask how, with our Muslim partners across the United States and beyond, can we deepen and widen and strengthen the relationship. And with the Abraham Accords, with peace now with 6 Arab countries, that gives us yet another platform on which to develop not just the geopolitical dimensions of this, but the interfaith dimensions of this. And we have in Rabbi David Rosen, based in Jerusalem, our international interreligious director. So we have both a domestic team, we have an international team, we have the experience of the 20th century, we have the absolute determination not to let the inevitable obstacles get in our way or discourage us. We want to make the 21st century the century of advances in Muslim-Jewish relations, coupled with advances in relations between the Arab world, Israel, and the Jewish people.
Thank you, David, for both the context and the look ahead for AJC's work. I know you also have strong feelings about International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which we marked last week. And I know that you view that day in a particular way. Can you share it with the audience as well?
Yes, I can. You're absolutely right, Jillian. And of course, I think for many of us, myself included, the day has very special and very personal meaning. But I came to understand that as someone who's been invited to speak on January 27th in a number of settings, that too often in those ceremonies in which I participated, there was something missing. What was present was solemnity, sadness, tears, memory. That was present. But what was missing, I found too often, was any reference to contemporary anti-Semitism and any reference in particular to Israel. And as one who believes that we must remember, we're commanded, zachor in Hebrew, remember, lo tishkach, do not forget. Memory is essential, but it's insufficient. The memory will preserve the integrity of what happened. so that people will not, if you will, have been murdered a second time through denial or rationalization or trivialization. But alas, that will not bring them back. It will not bring back my family or the families of others who were murdered. Those who genuinely understand the meaning of International Holocaust Remembrance Day must also understand that the real test for us is our obligation to living Jews, even as we honor the memory of murdered Jews. And those Jews live across the United States, across Latin America, across Europe, in North Africa, in the Middle East, in South Africa, in Asia. They're living Jews. And we're living at a time when anti-Semitism is on the up. So what is the obligation of those who want to remember January 27th, want to remember the liberation of Auschwitz, to living Jews? And when it comes to living Jews, nearly half of living Jews today live in the only Jewish majority nation on earth, Israel. So if one really wants to show commitment to living Jews, one has to show, I believe, an understanding both for the threats to Jews across the world today, coming from multiple sources, and also the threats to Israel. I'm not now talking about somehow walling off Israel from scrutiny or criticism. I'm saying something else. As long as a nation like Iran sits in the United Nations and calls for a world without Israel, and funds and arms its proxies like Hezbollah and yes, Hamas, to try and help wipe out Israel, I believe that everyone who genuinely is committed to Holocaust memory, Gillian, must look with one eye at the past to protect memory, which is being challenged, and one eye at the present, because Jews today are being threatened. And that's the ultimate test. Will living Jews be protected, even as we honor the memory, but cannot bring back the 6 million who perished?
Absolutely. And David, you mentioned that anti-Semitism is on the up. And I would say it's really on the minds of everyone in this moment. If we needed reminders, there are more than plenty from all sides of this anti-Semitism spectrum. And for years, I've heard you use the word swivel-headed when talking about anti-Semitism. So can you help us understand what you mean by this and your assessment of anti-Semitism at this time?
So if I can dial back for a moment to the year 2000, 2001, just over 20 years ago, when my family and I spent a year living in Geneva, Switzerland. And we began to both see and also, in some respects, experience a new surge in anti-Semitism. And over time, as we watched it, as we blew the whistle, as we traveled to European capitals, we came to understand that there were not one or two, but three sources of this sort of surge in anti-Semitism. And depending on the country, depending on the circumstance, depending on the moment, it could be one or two or all three. The threats were coming first and foremost at the time from the jihadists. The first Jews killed in Europe as a result of the surge in anti-Semitism, Gillian, beginning in the early 2000s, were killed at the hands of jihadists, whether in Denmark, whether in France, whether in Belgium, whether in Bulgaria, or those attempts that were thwarted. The second came from the resurgent neo-Nazi movement, especially in certain parts of Europe, that were nostalgic for an earlier era, that framed themselves as populists, but were really xenophobes and anti-Semites, who had either historical amnesia or historical memory for a Nazi fascist era. And then the third, which was sometimes the hardest to kind of define, were the far left. Because the far left did not attack synagogues, it did not kill children in Toulouse, it did not march down the street with Nazi symbols. But the far left did everything possible through flotillas and and court action and BDS movements to try and deny the right of the Jewish people to sovereignty in Israel. The nearly 7 million Jews living in Israel and their right to independence. Again, I'm not now speaking about whether one is left of center or right of center. That was not the issue. It was rather the denial of sovereignty while upholding the right of sovereignty of everyone else on the planet. So those were the three sources. And then they came across the Atlantic Ocean. And what we said in Europe and what we said here, Gillian, is too many people are trying to weaponize or instrumentalize the issue of anti-Semitism because they have a kind of ideological or political or partisan stake in it. So if they're on the right, they're much happier pointing the finger at the left or jihadists. If they're on the left, they're much happier pointing the finger at the right. We, AJC, and I personally, did not sign up to endorse or support a political party or a political ideology. We exist centrally to stand up to anti-Semitism, whoever, wherever, whatever, and whenever. And this sometimes gets us into trouble because those who want to weaponize or instrumentalize anti-Semitism want to point the finger only in one direction, and we're not willing to go along. We're saying that it's a danger and it comes from multiple directions. We don't need a reminder in the United States right now, or do we, that when we have a member of Congress who purveys vile conspiracy theories about Jewish space lasers and Rothschild funding and all the rest, this is really scary. Scary. Sitting in Congress as a new member. And we don't need reminders, or do we, about Charlottesville, about Pittsburgh, about Poway, about that whole dark web that pervades all kinds of anti-Semitic insanities, but too often with a willing audience. Period, full stop. But there's a second paragraph, and that's where some people start to want to say, wait a second. And I'm saying, no, we have to keep going in our analysis. That first group is frightening, it's real, it's present, and it needs to be confronted. But frankly, just as the United States had to face war both in the Pacific and in Europe and in North Africa, we could not get to choose our wars in 1941 and 42. We have a second war going on. That second war doesn't take the form of Nazis marching through the streets of Charlottesville, but ask pro-Israel students in more and more high schools across this country. Ask pro-Israel students on more and more university campuses across this country. What threats do they see to themselves as Jews or as pro-Israel activists or as Zionists? And they will tell you it's not as visible, but it's no less pernicious. It's entering the classrooms and the quads and the student governments. It's trying to deny both Israel and its supporters their rights. It's also pointing fingers at Jews as people of privilege or somehow on the wrong side of the new identity equation in America. And yes, there are a tiny handful of members of Congress who have purveyed views that I believe are both anti-Semitic and entail inferences of blood libels, of dual loyalty, which are toxic. Now, I want to stress again, because I know from experience, this is not an issue of comparing. This is not a competition for who's at the top. This is simply saying that if people are serious about dealing with anti-Semitism, they must be swivel-headed and nonpartisan and non-political. If they're coming at this with a political label because they want to defend their side and point the finger at the other side, we're not willing to go along with it. And of course, there's the third piece of this. As I mentioned, in Europe, it was from jihadist elements. Let me stress, not all Muslims. No one is talking about, God forbid, a broad brush stroke. But within Islam, there have been and there continue to be those who refer to Jews as the children of, quote, apes and pigs, who have detestable views about Jews and who in some cases have acted violently on those views. We, the American Jewish Committee, must be swivel-headed. We are American, we are global. We need to assess in each situation the level of threat, the level of danger, the need for security, the need for consultation with governments and law enforcement officials. But for those out there who want to say, focus all your attention only on one source, my answer is we would not be honest and fulfilling our mandate as an advocacy organization committed to nonpartisanship and to independence if we didn't address all the threats. Again, mindful of where each threat is at any given moment in any given place.
Thank you, David. It's very frightening, and I think we all should be swivel-headed. You know, AJC will continue, and we should all really look at the different threats this way. If I can just switch gears a little bit to Germany. As you know, David, Germany faces an election this year, and Germany has been a big factor in AJC's global thinking. You know, from the early days, AJC was the pathbreaker in German-Jewish relations. And fast forward to today, where we have a thriving office in Berlin and follow the issues in Germany very closely. So this year, Germany will change chancellors. After Angela Merkel, what do you see happening in Germany? How do you see this all playing out?
I think it's almost impossible to imagine a Germany without Angela Merkel. I mean, since she started her campaign in 2005, I remember vividly because we, AJC, had a large delegation in Berlin in 2005 to mark the 25th anniversary of our partnership with the Adenauer Foundation. And Angela Merkel broke her campaign schedule. She was running for chancellor. It was a big deal to come and join us and to celebrate that 25th anniversary of the AJC Adenauer exchange program and partnership. So ever since then, for the last 16 years, not only has she been the leader, but for so many, I think it's fair to say she's been sort of the comfort politician. You know, people look at Angela Merkel, whether in Germany, whether in Europe more generally, many of us here in the United States, and we feel that, you know, there's security, there's stability represented by Angela Merkel and her sort of calm leadership of Germany. No leadership is perfect. We don't endorse candidates who run for office, but I think it's fair to say that Angela Merkel has played that role, and it's not by accident that many Germans refer to her by a German nickname, Mutti, which is a reference to mother, as if she were the mother figure of Germany. I say this really because it's the only way I can answer your question, Jillian, because Germany is now about to leave that behind. And there is a new leader of her party, the Christian Democratic Party. He's the governor of what we would call the governor in American terms of the president of North Rhine-Westphalia. I believe it's the largest of the 16 states in Germany. He's presumed to be the front runner, but Germany is a country that sort of falls somewhere between the United States and Israel on the sort of political makeup spectrum. That is, Germany does not have a two-party election the way we do in the United States, with few exceptions. It does not have a how many, a gazillion parties as Israel seems to have. But I can't recall a time when Germany did not have a coalition government. So I think what we're looking at, Jillian, is number one, who is most likely to be the winner in the elections, I think in September, that is the leading party. And then what are the most likely sort of configurations for coalition? And by the way, reminder, even with Angela Merkel's popularity, she always formed a coalition government. So, for example, Heiko Maas, who is the foreign minister, does not come from Angela Merkel's party, not at all. So we're really looking at two things, Jillian. The likeliest leader of each of the parties in the election and which party will win, and then what will the most likely coalition be resulting from that victory. In many ways, we will be in a new era, even if the Christian Democrats win with their new leader, simply because, again, 16 years in politics is a lifetime. And now we have to look sort of to the post-Angela Merkel era. Believe me, it will be a very interesting trajectory.
Absolutely, and I'm sure many on this call will be following it closely. So thank you.
So let's come back to that discussion. In August, September, October, when we see what's happening, and then when we can assess the implications for the European Union. Germany is the leader, the transatlantic partnership, the Middle East, Germany's special relationship with Israel, the fight against anti-Semitism. There's an awful lot for us to assess, but we're still a few months away, Jillian.
Definitely. And, while we're just speaking about sort of the transfer of power, transfer of democracy, we recently saw a shaky transfer of power here in America. And this isn't singular to America. So I wanted to ask you, where else is this happening and what are the global trends here?
Well, let's begin with America first, because many of us, myself included, are Americans. And we're now, 12 days into the new Biden administration. But as I said earlier, there are still many Americans who cling to the belief that this was somehow an illegitimate or stolen election. AJC was very clear, for those who may not follow us on social media, whether Facebook or Twitter in particular, but AJC was very clear in our statements that we are fiercely nonpartisan, but we are absolutely committed to core values of democracy, including the peaceful transfer of power. And we felt, particularly after January the 6th, that what was witnessed, that we had to also speak up to make sure our voice was heard about the need to reject violence as a tool of political intimidation, and to understand that President Trump had every right to question if he wanted, to bring the issue to the courts if he wanted, but every response from the courts had turned down the president's assertions. There had to come a point where we engage in a peaceful transfer of power, and AJC made very clear that we wanted to affirm that and move on to the new Biden administration. And again, that generated some controversy. Are you really nonpartisan? The answer is yes, we are really nonpartisan in 1,000 ways. But we're not nonpartisan about democratic values. And I don't mean Democratic Party values. I mean the values of democracy. And we thought that they were being questioned and challenged in a very negative way. Having said that, we have a big challenge in America. I won't call it unity. I know some politicians are talking about unity. I'll call it cohesion. At the end of the day, we need to be one country, not two countries in one, with two completely different sort of political narratives, historical narratives, social narratives. And that's the part where I continue to worry. Can AJC play a role in helping to restore the sense of cohesion? That doesn't mean necessarily that everyone has to agree with everyone. That will never happen, nor should it happen in a democracy, a real democracy, only in a sham democracy, where 99.9% vote for the Soviet leader, for example. But can we restore the glue that binds us together as a nation? Can we agree on principles of civility, of dialogue, of consensus, of compromise, of the search for bipartisanship. I know to some these sound like sort of very cliched words, very tired words, and each side will immediately sort of pull back and say, yes, but we agree, but look at the other side. I mean, to me, that's not a formula for moving forward. I think before we all look at other sides, we have to look at ourselves and see whether we're doing our part. AJC wants to do its part in this respect. Now, we're not alone. Your question was very, very spot on. It's no secret that liberal democracy has had its share of challenges in different parts of the world. China has tried to offer itself as a different model, a more successful, a more efficient model for organizing society, for delivering on prosperity, on productivity, even on response to COVID. And now we see, for example, in Europe, which to me at the moment is the most preoccupying challenge, we have a very interesting situation where Britain, by that Brexit vote in 2016, has now formally, officially left the European Union. And now Britain is on its own on COVID. And the remaining 27 are dealing with COVID and the vaccine as a group. And now the press suggests that Britain on its own has had a better response to vaccinations, far better than Europe. So at the moment, I worry, first of all, because much of my family lives in France, my wife's family lives in Italy, and they're behind on the vaccination. But it's also raising questions about the EU and whether it can deliver in a timely way at moments of such crisis. And we're not eager to see other countries peel off from the European Union. And I say this for one very simple reason. The European Union has been the most ambitious and successful peace project in modern history. I'm not worried about whether they can agree with each other on who gets to own Parmesan cheese or Camembert cheese. Europe has stood together as a monument to peace. If it begins to unravel, who knows what the future holds? But that means that Europe has to show its citizens that Britain's ability to deal with the vaccination should not come at the expense of Europe's sense of self. So there are huge challenges, not just in the United States as we speak, Jillian. There are huge challenges right now in the 27-member European Union and other nations that look to the European Union from the periphery as a model.
Thank you, David. And since you mentioned Israel's democratic process earlier as well, and as we know, Israelis will now be returning to the polls, I think, for the fourth time in the past 2 years. So how is AJC viewing this, and what's your analysis in this moment?
I guess Israel loves elections so much, loves democracy so much, as you said, 4 times in 2 years. And the election, I think, is on March 23rd, so we're about 7 weeks away. I just checked the latest polls before this conversation, and it seems that, at least as of today, that can change tomorrow or the day after, it probably will change. Prime Minister Netanyahu's party is in the strongest position. If the elections were held today, this poll suggested that he would get about 30 what are called mandates, if you will, seats in the parliament. That would make him the largest party, and therefore, for those who know the Israeli process, Israeli President Rivlin will study the results of the election and then invite the person or the party he thinks is most likely to be able to form a government. If indeed the Likud party led by Netanyahu remains in this front-running position, in all likelihood, President Rivlin would ask Prime Minister Netanyahu to take the first stab at forming a government. And then we go into all the coalition politics and all the brinkmanship up until the last minute and all the small parties trying to extract whatever they can. in my judgment, and I'm a very big lifelong fan of Israel, it's not the prettiest system in the world. When small parties can play this game and leverage their power, having 2, 3, 4 seats, to squeeze concessions from the big party. But there we have it. And I'll still take this version over Soviet-style, quote, democracy, which I experienced during the Cold War. What's interesting is that there are at least 2 other strong right-wing parties that are competing directly, I think more or less for the same constituency as Netanyahu. They're led by Gideon Sa'ar, who formerly was in the cabinet, and Naftali Bennett, who also was formerly in the cabinet. They're both on the right. I think right now that they're running perhaps in 3rd and 4th positions with Yair Lapid at the moment, and his party, Yesh Atid, perhaps sort of in the 2nd position. Again, all of this can change in many ways. In Israeli politics, never believe the word never. When people say we will never enter a coalition, we will never sit in the same cabinet at the same cabinet table as so and so, I would not take that to the bank. There's a lot of maneuvering that's still going to take place over the next 7 weeks and after the election as leaders try and form those coalitions. So let's return to the subject once we have concrete results of the election itself.
Never a dull moment, as we say.
And never say never.
Never say never. David, I want to ask one more question before turning it back to Daniel to maybe sneak in 1 or 2 audience questions as well. So if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned earlier this concept of centrism and nonpartisanship. And I believe that you developed these ideals when you were in high school and college, in other words, before you were at AJC. But in today's hyper-partisan, deeply divided America, you continue to sort of, define yourself and AJC as centrist and independent, and that guides a lot of our work, every piece of our work. So 2 questions. Number 1, what exactly, do you mean by this? And number 2, how difficult are you finding it to remain centrist and sort of, nonpartisan in this deeply divided America?
Well, the answer to the second question is, it's never been easy. It's not easy now, especially with a deeply divided America. I think it's all the more essential and important that we have groups that proudly define themselves as independent, nonpartisan, and centrist. Because again, if we're going to restore the glue and the cohesion to keep this extraordinary country together, and not permit the centrifugal forces to continue to pull us apart, we need more independents, nonpartisans, and centrists. So I'm proud of that role, even though what it means is we're frequently being attacked by both sides. For the right, our centrism is too much a gesture to the left, and for the left, our centrism is too much a gesture to the right. I think they both very consciously and very willingly choose to misunderstand what it means, why we are the way we are, but there it is. And so we, those of us in this position all have scars to show, but I think also pride as well. Let me just dial back, Jillian, for a moment. I realized in myself that this came long before long before I found AJC. Thankfully, I first encountered AJC in 1978. I come from parents, perhaps very unusually in today's world, who were victims of both the left and the right. I mean victims. I mean, my mother was born in the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as it was called, the USSR. They were a Jewish family in the Soviet Union, and they experienced the tyranny of the Soviet Union, the so-called Brotherhood of Nationalities, a sham, and they experienced the tyranny of the Soviet Union against Jews before the war and again after the war. My mother and my father were both victims of Nazism and fascism, directly. My mother and her family had escaped to France. Nazi Germany occupied France in 1940, joined with their French Vichy collaborators. My mother and her family understood exactly what fascism means, exactly. And my father came from Austria. He escaped. He came to France. He was put in a Vichy camp for 3 years. He escaped from that camp in Algeria, and he joined the OSS, the wartime espionage services in the United States, and he fought behind enemy lines for the remainder of the war. My family knows what communism means and what fascism means. And they taught me something: liberal democracy, not illiberal democracy. Liberal democracy is the most precious political gift we will ever be given. And we must defend it at all costs from all enemies of liberal democracy, whether they come from the far left, whether they come from the far right. So AJC is not an organization that's masquerading as a Jewish advocacy group, but that has tied its fate to a political party in the United States. As long as political parties here are democratic in the lowercase sense of the word, we will remain nonpartisan, independent, and centrist. We're here to stand up for our own values, not for a party, for our own values. When the party agrees with us, we will say thank you. And when they disagree with us, we will oppose them respectfully, knowing that there will be yet another issue tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And that is the AJC's unique brand of independence, centrism, and nonpartisanship.
Thank you, David. Daniel, do we have time for maybe one audience question?
Sure. So we have about 100 plus questions, but I'll try and choose one.
Actually, try and squeeze two in, Daniel. I'll be brief.
Sure. There's an overwhelming majority of people that are asking for you to return to Iran. Given what we know about
I'd rather stay in New York. I don't want to return to
Iran. Given what we know about the team that Biden has put into place, and of course what we know about Biden himself, what can we expect in the coming weeks or months with regards to Iran and the JCPOA and future negotiations?
So very briefly, it deserves a longer answer. I know the conventional thinking among many is President Biden has sort of brought the team back together again. And so they're going to reconstruct the 2015 accord after President Trump pulled out of the accord 3 years later. I would like to believe analytically, not just aspirationally, that the team is certainly sophisticated enough to know that whatever situation they saw in 2015 is not the situation in 2021. 6 years have passed. Much has been learned by many. So I want to believe that the Biden team, though eager to try and negotiate a deal with Iran, will keep in mind the last 6 years, the experience of the last 6 years, and not just run sort of pell-mell back into the deal. I think they've already begun to make that clear, and we're certainly among those encouraging our friends in the administration, and we have many friends. Consider what happened these last 6 years. Consider the perspective of Sunni Arab countries in Israel. Consider the violations by Iran. Take all of this into account. And if we're going to go into New Deal, let it reflect the reality of 2021 and not the reality of 2015.
Thank you, David. So I'll get to one final question. This is from Shrub Kempner in Galveston. He is asking, he said just days ago, the U.S. suspended the $23 billion sale of the F-35s to the UAE that followed the Abraham Accords. Will this move significantly undermine the Accords, or do you believe that momentum is strong enough to overcome this?
Well, I want to be an optimist here. For those of you who know the Israeli city Petah Tikva, the Hebrew words mean a kind of abode or residence of hope. So call me as one living in a Petach Tikva, an abode of hope shrub. I'd like to believe that after the review of the F-35 sale, whatever the hesitation may be on the part of the new administration, they will honor a commitment made by a previous administration. And here I don't label the previous administration the Trump administration, because traditionally in American foreign policy, new administrations have honored the formal agreements entered into by previous administrations. So I hope that will continue. AJC have been strong supporters of the US-UAE relationship. We believe that we support the F-35 sale, and we believe that for a variety of reasons, again, we don't have the time, it should go forward. Yes, it will strengthen the Abraham Accords, and it will send a message that even as administrations change, and they inevitably do in a democracy, America will stand by whatever commitments have been made to countries, in this case to Morocco, to Sudan, to the UAE, and to Bahrain. And if the new administration is able to pull off additional deals with additional Arab countries, as we certainly hope will be the case, then I hope whatever administration will follow them will also respect those commitments. That's the only way to ensure American credibility and continuity in foreign policy. And again, understanding that new administrations may otherwise see the world differently. I get that. But I believe that at the end of the day, they should and they will honor the commitments of previous administrations, particularly when those deals were made in the name of advancing peace, cooperation, and conflict resolution in the Middle East.
David, we're running towards the end of the hour here. So my apologies to the hundreds of others who are tuning in with questions. But David, it's really always so helpful and fascinating to get your take on what's going on in the world and how to process it for the Jewish community. So thank you.
Julian, thank you. And thank you to all who joined us for this call. And if this is the kind of, not just conversation that engages you, but if this is the kind of outlook on the world that touches you, if you're new to AJC, join us, learn more about us. We're strengthened by one another. So please check us out, and we hope to see more of you in the coming days and weeks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for our global audience for joining us. As David mentioned, if you'd like to learn more about American Jewish Committee, please visit us at ajc.org. Thank you again, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.